What is art? Does it have any unity? What is the definition of art? How do we know if something is good or bad art? Oftentimes, especially in the context of American modernity, we're taught implicitly or explicitly that anything can be art, that any mode of self-expression that is an active expression of our subjectivity is a form of artwork. We're often taught that art doesn't require apprenticeship, that art doesn't require skill, that art merely requires a kind of act of the will. How do we come to some agreed upon definition of artwork in the wake of the fact that no definition seems to really exist? Can we arrive at some tradition, some mode of understanding by which to even conceptualize what artists are doing? I contend and argue that the way to avoid the errors of postmodernity, the errors of contemporary modes of understanding or thinking about artistic expression, is to return to a premodern, early mode of thinking about art. And that's to return to the notion of art as a virtue. Before the period of Romanticism in the 18th and 19th century, artistic skill and artistic craft was understood to be the same as artisanship or craftsmanship. So that is to say, the painter, the composer, the poet were not essentially different from the carpenter or the tradesman. They were not distinct in terms of definition per se, but distinct in terms of degree, distinct in terms of application. So what does that mean? Well, all of these different kinds of profession, all of these different vocations were mediated by one commonality. They were mediated by the virtue of art. That is to say, a habit or a quality within the soul that makes an artist an artist. So what that means is that artwork was principally vocational. It was functional within the society within which artwork would have been produced. And therefore, it was understood to be a profession that you get paid to do. You actually earn an income to be an artist within pre-modern medieval societies. We see this all the time. An example of this could be the medieval city. So there was the sense within the medieval city that there was a kind of integration, a kind of mediation of commonly held values. So the medieval city was built with a structured worldview, namely the Christian, and in the Western context, the Catholic worldview, that systematized the city and held the city in place by a kind of internal universe, a microcosm. It was based on fundamentally two principles, the first of which is beauty, the second of which is functionality. So in the pre-modern conception of artwork, artwork was principally beautiful. That is to say, it oriented itself objectively to the production of things that participated in the transcendental beauty of God. And secondly, it was functional. It actually worked. So if you build a chair, for example, that's not beautiful, then it's not a chair that's worth producing in a certain sense. It doesn't participate to an exemplary degree in the transcendental beauty of the Godhead. So a chair needs to actually work as a chair. If a chair has two legs and topples over when you sit down on it, it's not a good chair. It doesn't fit the function of a chair. So that is to say, every artwork has a functional purpose, but it also participates in God's beauty. The tradition that I'm building upon, principally speaking, to articulate these two aspects of an artistic product, namely beauty and functionality, is the Thomistic tradition, namely that tradition that follows from St. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century theologian and philosopher and churchman. So from Aristotle, from the Nicomachean Ethics, he understands, that is to say, St. Thomas understands, art to be a habit in the soul. So the Greek word for art that Aristotle would have used in the Nicomachean Ethics is technē. So technē is art. It is doing things that are practical. It is making things that are functional within the society in which it is made. In Latin, St. Thomas uses ars. And ars is a direct translation of technē. It means, principally speaking, the same thing that Aristotle would have meant by technē, but this notion of ars is inscribed within a Christian worldview. So in order to understand how technē or ars fits within the structure of the soul, we have to understand what a habit or a virtue is. A habit is not typically what we mean by the word habit in modern culture, though it has some relation to it. It has some similarity. A habit is a disposition in the soul that is oriented to a particular operation of the soul. So in other words, a habit allows a human person more readily to do a particular action either for good or for ill. So a good habit is called a virtue, a bad habit is called a vice. So art is a virtue. It is a habit. It's a good habit. St. Thomas defines art as right reason applied to things to be made. So art is directly related to prudence, the virtue of prudence. The difference is on account of the object. So prudence is right reason concerning things to be done. So it's internal. Whereas art, in the way in which we judge the virtue of art, or ars, is based on making. So the virtue of art is not properly directed to the soul, but it's directed to things out in the world. It's directed to making things. So Aristotle understands art as imitation. So art imitates nature. The operation undergirding the manner in which we make things is parallel to, or is proportional with, the manner in which things naturally operate. However, St. Augustine understands art, the rational making of things, to be an imitation of the divine art. By imitating God, we participate vertically within the structure of creation. So St. Thomas applies both of these definitions. The first of which is horizontal, art imitates nature. The second of which is vertical, art imitates God's creation, or God's act of creation. And then he converges them in the idea of art as a virtue. That is to say, art as a good quality of the mind directed to the production or the making of things. It's something that's cultivated over time. It's a habit that you develop. It's not principally some kind of mode of self-expression. It's not principally some kind of experience. While those things are valuable when thinking about art, rather it is principally an objective quality of the structure of the soul. So my claim, which is not a radical claim at all, is that the virtue of art, as St. Thomas describes it, is proportional to beauty. That is to say, things produced through the virtue of art need to be, by necessity, beautiful. So for St. Thomas, beauty is rational. It has two components, one of which is subjective, the other of which is objective. The subjective dimension of beauty is the following. Beauty is pleasing when seen. Okay, but what St. Thomas means by seeing is a kind of intellectual seeing, an apprehension, a visio. So that is to say, when we see something truly, we understand what the thing is. Secondly, the objective dimension of beauty is that beauty has three principal components. In Latin, it's integritas, consonantia, and claritas. I translate those as perfection, representational symmetry, and clarity or intelligibility. So the virtue of art is conformed to right reason. So art is rational. Beauty is also rational. Okay, so metaphysically, so in the thing itself, beauty and goodness are identical, but in our cognition, as we understand and intend the things of our experience, they have a conceptual distinction. Beauty relates to the manner in which we apprehend things in the world. An artwork, that is to say, something produced through ours, again, must have the three characteristics that objectively characterize beauty. So, perfection, symmetry, and radiance. Secondly, it must be pleasing when seen. It must be pleasing when we apprehend or behold the object. So let's take a step back from all of this. The artist is an artisan. The artist is a craftsman, so anyone who makes things well in the world participates and actualizes in a very real way the virtue of ars. Now, perfect ars, the perfect way in which the virtue of ars operates, is in the life of the Christian. Christian art reaches the perfection of art. And we can see this in the best kinds of art that are directed to liturgy, as well as the best kinds of art that are circumscribed by the objective transcendence of the triune God, revealing himself within the social, political, natural, and ecclesial realities within which we participate.